Hi, my name is Olutimi Osasono, and I welcome you again to this session of discussions on issues bordering national development. And today I have my very good friend, Rodrigo. How are you today?
Hi, Jimmy. I'm fine. What about you?
Yeah, I'm very well. So glad to
Great.
have you here today. And today we're going to be talking about middle income trap. And we look at developments of some middle income countries. To start with, I want to draw your attention to the works of Peter Robertson. He published that in 2016 and at the World Economic Forum.
Mhm.
He asked a very critical question. Said, does middle income trap exist? And his argument basically, he looked at the middle income distributions and looked at countries that have been designated to be under middle income trap for a very long time. And he studied them and characterized those countries into two different groups. Some countries have experienced very slow but steady growth, which they've not been able to transit, while the other ones have experienced very fast growth at some point and it began to decline. So they can't obviously transit. So, what do you think about that?
Well, Jimmy, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, after the middle income trap concept was formulated, a lot of researchers started investigating into it. And after that, I believe there was a stronger consensus around the idea that such a thing does not exist, or at least not in the way that it was formulated originally in 2007 by two World Bank economists. Um, so yeah, but still, yeah. But basically, what the critics found is that countries that are stuck in middle income trap, most of them at least, they actually never had a very fast pace of growth. So they wouldn't. They kept their trends. They were growing slowly, and then they became middle income, but then they kept growing slowly again. And because of this, they could never transit to the high income status. But I think that regardless of the fact if this concept is real and applicable or not, I think we can say that a lot of countries, and my country can be included in that for sure, have a very hard time trying to make at least the transition from middle income status to high income status. So we see that it's easier to make the transition from low income to middle income status, but to do it from middle income to high income is very complicated, even though some countries have already succeeded in that.
Wow. Are we looking at that concept of middle income trap not in the derogatory term because we believe that it is something that should be welcome. It's something that you should put pressure on middle income countries. You know, when you hear middle income trap or a trap,
Yes.
it suggests to you that someone needs to get out of that trap, right? So the underlying issues are issues of development. Uh, nations have not been able to develop to that extent where it is very obvious they've transited from one level to the other. So, in your own view, what do you think is responsible for that long, slow growth, in that middle income category?
Yeah. Okay. So, Timmy, well, I will give my personal opinion, but it was also found by some researchers that wanted to criticize this concept, that one of the reasons for countries not being able to make this transition was their inability or lack of capability to make policies, like good effective policies, to make this transition. Because when we talk about transitioning from middle to high income status, we are usually referring to a country's capability to invest in its manufacturing sector, and especially the high technology manufacturing sector. This is with few exceptions. So to do this, you need to make industrial policy. Like, industry does not arise from nowhere.
Yeah.
You need to make policies to create a manufacturing sector in your country. This happened with every country, basically every country that has industrialized. Even Britain Great Britain, the UK, the first country to industrialize, and who did it in the most um, slowly way and the most spontaneous way, so to speak. Even they had a lot of government intervention to assure their manufacturing sector would remain strong and would remain like a superpower in the world. So yeah, if you talk about industry, you have to talk about industrial policy, and this is even more true today after the 2008 crisis, after the pandemic. There was an even stronger consensus around this, a consensus that had almost disappeared before, but now it has come back. So for a country to make this transition, it must be able to do these policies, and to make these policies work, yeah, you have to have the strength to do coordinated efforts. Yeah, to make it effective.
Yeah, looking at countries like Brazil, some other Argentina, some other Latin American countries, um, from the lenses of low-income countries, uh, they see advantages. They see potentials in some of these countries. You have energy. Brazil, of course, about 83% of your energy is renewable.
Yes.
You have that in place. You have some necessary infrastructure in place. You have access to capital. Now, why is it that with all these advantages that low income countries doesn't have, it's still difficult to have a policy coordination to achieve industrialization?
Well, Jimmy, I believe in this case, it's mostly because of like the way our country, the way our society is organized, because it's hard. Like we're having a hard time trying to make an effective industrial policy there. And why is that? Well, because we have a macroeconomic policy framework that hinders the ability of the government to make industrial policy, and especially effective industrial policy. So, well, our policy framework is based mostly on high real interest rates to attract foreign capital, and this makes it almost impossible to invest in industry unless you have subsidies. But we don't have this now, so industry is not a very interesting sector to invest in Brazil. And well, this is due to political reasons, because there's no support for this sector. And besides this, we also have a free floating exchange rate regime. So it's very hard for you to invest in industry, because when we talk about industry, especially the most technological sector, we are talking about maturing terms, I guess, for investments that take years, like can take even decades. So how can you make any planning if you don't know how the exchange rate is going to be tomorrow? How can you plan something for 5 years from now if you don't know how the exchange rate is going to be tomorrow? But this only exists to make the current macroeconomic policy framework work. So if you don't do anything to change that, it's impossible to do effective industrial policy. We must make the distinction. And if you don't do that, it's impossible to develop your manufacturing sector, to increase wages in the sector and in all other sectors, because more industry means more technological development. More technological development means more productivity, and more productivity means higher wages. This is the case for developed countries. That's why they developed, because their economy is more productive, and it's not because their citizens are better or smarter, but it's because they have more capital in their production, more technology, so their workers can be more productive with that. So since we cannot do that, we cannot advance with our development process. And this happens mostly, I'm talking about Brazilian case, but if you take any other case, it will be a similar situation. The thing is that when a society develops, interests in different groups also start to develop. It's these vested interests that prevent the status quo from changing. And in this case, like when you have strong interests, in the case of Brazil, for example, centered around a current macroeconomic policy framework, it's very hard to do anything to change that. And with this, you cannot make the policies that could boost development um, to work. You cannot make them work.
Wow, talking about macroeconomic policies, let's talk about currency exchange rates. Which is is a major issue in developing countries. Recently, my country, Nigeria, the government floated the naira. And left it to the forces of the market. To decide its fate. There are arguments that if the country, the government, have too much hands, too much control over its market, it becomes an unfavorable destination for foreign investors. So investors are looking at markets where they can put in their money and take it out. They are looking at markets where the forces of demand and supply will prevail, as against government controlling. So they are trying to balance bringing in foreign direct investments into your country and also looking at the national interest and controlling your currency. What do you think about that?
Well, Timmy, I believe that every government should have a high degree of control over exchange rate, like especially for developing countries. Maybe not that much for developed countries, but for developing countries is very important because control of the exchange rates, especially for developing countries, means basically controlling almost all the prices in the economy. And if you don't have control over it, it's very unlikely that you can make your country develop. And of course, I'm not talking about, when I talk about price control, I'm not talking about like making price tables for anything, of course. But what I mean is that when you don't have control over exchange rate, you don't have control, for example, over inflation anymore. Because when we talk about developing countries, our countries rely a lot on importing
Importation,
a lot of things, even basic things.
Yeah.
So if the exchange rate goes too high because, for example, of something that has nothing to do with our country, so if you take, for example, the pandemic or the 2008 crisis, because in every major crisis you have like a capital flight from countries that are considered unsafe
Yeah.
for investing, so like the usually developing countries, to safe countries, which are the developed countries.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have things that happen in the other side of the world that your government or your society had nothing to do about it. We did nothing to produce this event, but still it will have a strong influence on our lives because we didn't have this control over exchange rate.
Yeah.
And if you take every country that has succeeded in developing and like making a strong manufacturing sector, they all had, at least in a certain point in history, to have this control of their exchange rate. So if you take, for example, South Korea, they used the valuing of the exchange rate for decades to promote their exports. And of course, they also had to intervene in the exchange rate for imports because they had to import some inputs to make the goods that would be sold abroad.
Yeah.
So of course, they had to differentiate for these different cases.
Yeah.
This was also done in Brazil before, and like with relative success. If you take China, for example, the exchange rate here is very stable. Why? Because the government has a very strict control over the exchange rate. When countries started to adopt this kind of policy, they were told that it would lead to an exchange rate stabilization because the market forces would drive the prices, and the exchange rate is another price, to equilibrium. But what we saw, what we could observe in reality was the opposite. So it's very interesting, actually. If you take, for example, I was here in China before in 2018. Back then, my currency, the real, we could exchange one for almost 2 renminbi. And now we can exchange 1 real for like 1.45, 1.50. So it was a significant difference. But back then, 1 renminbi was close to $7. And now, almost 6 years later, it's still 1 to almost 7. The difference is not as large, even though they did some things like to devalue their currency even more because they needed to. It's still like you can see the different instability,
Yeah.
and they do that because they have a control over it. And even the devaluing that they had, it was intentional. The government said we need to do that because we need to boost our exports. It was not something that happened by chance. While in Brazil, it depends more on what happens abroad than what happens in the country, and it's the same case for all developing countries, I would say.
There's so much lessons to learn from that. And for example, in Nigeria, before now, there was a policy of multiple exchange rates. There are concessions granted to certain importation, like pharmaceutical, certain agri sector, some machineries. You want to purchase machinery, you have access to different exchange rates, But at the end of the day, we saw the whole thing shrouded in some level of corruption, deep corruption. People took advantage of that. People will always take advantage of things like that, and that made the parallel markets more profitable. They take money from here and take it to the parallel market, and they were making so much money. People were not really, the purpose of that policy was defeated. That was what motivated this current policy, of okay, let's float the currency and all that, and leave the whole thing to market forces. But even at that now, we are seeing so much sabotage, and all
Yes.
that. So, what do you think should be the way forward, for developing countries, especially? How do we balance bringing in investors into our countries, into our economies, at the same time not playing too much control, against their business interests? What do you think?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think in this case, yeah, we must know that foreign investment is good in general.
Yeah.
But the thing is that your country, like a country, must be able to determine where this investment is going to be put. So if you take Brazil, for example, foreign investors are usually very free to invest in the sector they want, and this makes them choose the financial sector usually, because it's safer, it's less risky, and like it's easier to put your money in and to take your money out whenever you want to. But the thing is that this kind of investment does not generate development.
Yeah.
And let's compare with China. If in China, they also made it very easy after the reforms in the late 1970s and the 80s, and some of them are actually still happening. They made it easier for foreign investors to invest here, to bring their money here. But what did they do? They made these investors to invest in the manufacturing sector, and they also imposed conditionalities. They said, you put your money here, like you have to leave it here for a certain period. You cannot put it here and take it back to your country in the next month. You will invest in manufacturing. You won't, like, you will be able to invest in financial markets, especially now, but it won't be that easy. It's better. We want you to invest in manufacturing.
China was able to impose that,
yes,
because they have some level of infrastructure in place, something that attracts, these investors. They know they have cheap labor, they have energy, they have the land, they have certain advantages, that they could trade with. And that's why, okay, if they're telling you, if you're bringing your money, you can't take it out in 5 years' time. The developing countries, low-income countries in Africa, even in my country, Nigeria, we don't have those advantages.
Okay.
So you don't have something to trade with, but you still have to attract investment. So that's my argument. What do you think we can begin to look at, to have a balance?
Well, I think, of course, infrastructure is very important, because it's something very basic if you're talking about production and distribution of goods. So of course, this is a necessary step, but it's not a sufficient step, because we must think again in industrial policy, because industrial policy also involves, for example, benefiting exports. So if for example, an investor has some tax benefits in a country to produce there and to export these goods, or maybe even sell to the domestic market, it will make it interesting for this investor to invest there. So and this should be, in theory, at least a simple measure. It's not like building a road that takes money, it takes time. It's something that is more simpler to do. So it depends. It still depends on a political decision. And China, and of course, this will be different to every country, but the principle is the same. China looked at the advantages it had to offer to the world, which is, like you mentioned, cheap labor and infrastructure. And well, even part of the infrastructure actually started to be built after they did those reforms and started to have
Yeah.
more money to build this
To build
infrastructure.
those infrastructure,
So
yeah.
you see that the like the two things
They work
are,
hand in hand.
yeah, like they mutually influence themselves. But of course, China looked at this advantage and made use of it. So I think it's up for other developing countries to do the same. You know, like what can you offer the world? Some countries, especially for example, small island countries, they will probably have a lot to offer in terms of tourism. So they should look to that and see how they could make good use of that. You know, or even right now this is not so important, but it will be in the future for these countries. They can also look at deep sea mining because in the future this will be very important, and they have a lot of reserves under their sea, the part of the sea that belongs to them. So this would be an advantage you could look at. In Nigeria, you could also talk about cheap labor because the population is huge, and you can also, and the wages are relatively low.
Yeah.
And but you could also talk about natural resources. You know, if take Congo for example, is a very rich in country in terms of resources.
Yeah.
But the thing is that you cannot just give it away for the for foreign agents, so to speak. You know, like for the world market, you cannot make your country export primary goods and think it's good to stop there and
Yeah.
depend on that for the rest of your life. You know, especially if you're talking about natural resources, because someday they will end.
Of course.
So, like it's if it's an advantage your country has, you must make use of it. But making use of it means that you must always be thinking the next step too. You know.
All right. Let's look at financial markets. And we take a case of your country. We have seen the pattern. The financial markets have been some level of impedance to diversification efforts of various countries, because financial markets sometimes can be very lucrative. You know, and people just want to put their funds there and take it out. You know, they don't want to look at other places for long term, you know, development. You know, so what can governments begin to do, you know, to have some level of control in the financial market, or initiatives for their financial market to be able to diversify their economies?